Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage was a watershed publication in Romanticism. Yes, I do have a portrait of him on my wall. Byron was made famous by this work. The reading public went crazy for this verse account of Byron's travels around Europe, his identity barely concealed behind the shadowy persona Childe Harold. Byron is said to have remarked, "I awoke one morning and found myself famous." Some modern commentators refer to Byron as the first celebrity in the modern sense. Not just that his work sold tens of thousands of copies, but that he became a figure of public fascination, what we would call lionization. He got piles of fan mail, people collected locks of his hair, and all sorts of obsessive behaviour we would associate nowadays with celebrities. The first two cantos or parts of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage were published in 1812, with the latter two parts coming in 1816 and 1818. With Byron catapulted to fame in 1812, the personality of the author became a matter of public interest, especially so because Byron was a noble, a peer of the realm. His debauched lifestyle was a subject of gossip, and he gave people plenty to gossip about, especially at the time that Canto 3 came about in 1816. Written in Spenserian stanzas, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage describes the grand tour, the trip around Europe that a young man of privilege would take to round off his education. Here's a map of the route that Byron took. The first two cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage take us through Spain, Portugal, Albania, and Greece. They were places that most people were unable to visit at the time, as I said a few weeks ago in relation to the Gothic. The book was an alternative to drab travel narratives for readers who longed to know of the outside world. To say something of the title, it was obvious to everyone that Childe Harold's Pilgrimage was a misnomer in a couple of senses. The first is that the so-called Childe Harold, child being an antiquated word for a noble, was a version of Byron himself. In the 1812 preface to the first publication, Byron admits that Childe Harold is a token figure, created, as he puts it, for the sake of giving some connection to the piece. Childe Harold throughout is a faint projection of Byron himself. We're told very little about Harold. At times Byron just drops the pretense and admits he is talking about himself very explicitly in the narrative. Another misnomer in the title is the use of the word pilgrimage, because it's obvious to us as we read that Childe Harold doesn't have any pilgrimage or quest at all. He leaves England for a journey that seems directionless and endless. He's not true to the tradition of the Grand Tour in the sense that he doesn't present the goal of educating himself with a little foreign culture and then returning home. He is a wanderer. Childe Harold has been disappointed in love, but otherwise we know very little about him. He's a detached figure. He is melancholy. He has the luxury of eloquent reflection on his disconsolate life. There's a self-indulgent quality to his despair. It's an experience of what the French call ennui, boredom carried through to the point of existential dissatisfaction. Childe Harold is haunted by feelings of insignificance and futility, as he puts it in Canto 3, the very knowledge that he had lived in vain. These points add up to what is called the Byronic hero, which was the main point of appeal for the original readership, this depth of character which draws the reader in. This is always a version of Byron himself. Exotic locations, in a sense then, are merely a foil, a background for the reflections of this tortured, brooding figure, always at centre stage. There is a darkness to him, but this darkness, the force of his passion, becomes the object of fascination to the reader, more so because of the transparent biographical portrait. We know we are reading about Byron himself, that these feelings couldn't simply be ventriloquized. Here is one of the explicit portrayals of that mentality, which accounts of Byron or Harold turning his back on humanity and its common enjoyments. There are parallels, if you've read Paradise Lost, with Satan's Pride, and there are Byron's trademark doses of misanthropy.
But soon he knew himself the most unfit of men to herd with man, with whom he held little in common, untaught to submit his thoughts to others, though his soul was quelled, in youth by his own thoughts. Still uncompelled, he would not yield dominion of his mind to spirits against whom his own rebelled. Proud though in desolation, which could find a life within itself to breathe without mankind.
Apart from the interest in the figure of the author, this is markedly different from other romantic poetry. Byron's intense emotional experience leaves no room for dialogues with philosophy, and his focus on exotic locations utterly disregards English settings and rural characters. There are no talkative yokels in Byron's poems. We are drawn to his iterations of personal unhappiness. This was something new. You'll notice that in Canto 3, Byron almost entirely dispenses with the pretended fictional aspect of the poem. He does take up the character of Harold briefly, but the line between truth and fiction is blurred. Canto 3 begins with a reflection on Byron's separation from his daughter Ada. So he begins Canto 3 by undermining the fictionality of the poem. He revives the pretense, simultaneously asserting that it is a pretense. So Byron is telling us that he will do whatever the hell he wants, and to hell with consistency. Canto 3 will take impetus from Byron's personal problems and relate them to the unfolding history of recent years, namely, most importantly, the Battle of Waterloo, marking the final downfall of Napoleon. With the starting point of seeing his daughter for the last time, Byron explores the individual suffering of separation from a loved one. But from visiting the site of the Battle of Waterloo, he juxtaposes this personal unhappiness with the collective suffering caused by war. In a nutshell, Canto 3 of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is about finding a way forward from pain, first personal and then collective. Byron's main problems in 1816 were personal and political. And I'm going to defer the political ones. I'm going to mention them in the next clip when I talk about Napoleon, and focus now on personal aspects of Byron's life. For starters, his wife had filed for separation in 1816. You may imagine that the Byronic hero is not strong marriage material. Byron woke abruptly on their wedding night, for example, and screamed, "I'm in hell." Byron didn't enjoy spending time with his wife, and there was infidelity across a variety of biological sexes and ages. We don't know what the official reason for the marital separation was. Most likely it is either that Byron had sodomized his wife or that he had conceived a child with his half-sister. Neither of these was exceptional behaviour in the Byronic lifestyle. His separation from his wife was subject to intense public scrutiny and gossip. He had married primarily to help with his debts. Annabella Milbank was wealthy. Now debt and scandal forced him into exile. Byron had no need to sustain the illusion of Childe Harold's inexplicable exile once he himself had been forced overseas. He had also suggested earlier in the poem that it was set in the past. Now he brushes Childe Harold aside because he wants to discuss the contemporary figure of Napoleon.